Hello, everyone. This is the chapter 4 overview. And hang on, this is just a bit. Okay. Let's see. Chapter 4 is very focused on how we think about the world around us, which social psychologists call social cognition, right? Our brains are constantly taking in information from our um, social environments, whether it's school or work, etc., and processing that information. Much of it is automatic processing, which you might remember we discussed in chapter 1, where it's processing of information that our brain does without us even being aware of it versus the conscious or controlled processing where we are, sitting down, maybe working a math problem, or we're trying to solve a Sudoku puzzle, or whatever it might be, where we're consciously trying to process information. So let's take a look here. So first off, one of the things that researchers have discovered is that because we're always processing information around us, we tend to believe that our ability to take in information, to think about it logically and rationally, is present almost all the time, which is actually often not true. There are actually many instances in which, yes, we are taking information in and our brains are processing it, but our brains are relying on automatic processing, which means that our brains are making judgments about the things that we see, the people we meet, based upon information that's already been filed away. And that information that is new might not match what we already know, but our brains count it as similar, and so we make the same kind of judgment about a person or a new idea or event based on what's already in our brains. And so it turns out that we're not always as rational and analytical as we believe ourselves to be. And of course, if we are wrong in our assessment of some social environment or some person, then that, of course, is going to influence how we behave toward that person or within that social environment. And, it may mean that sometimes we are interacting based on faulty information, to say the least. Of course, a lot of the automatic processing that our brains do is based upon that information that we've learned from our various social environments through that process of socialization that we discussed in the last chapter, thinking about how we may have learned stereotypes about certain people, we may have prejudices even because of the stereotypes that are in our heads. So here's a quick one. Think about how if you're, somebody who you have a neighbor who's an old crotchety neighbor, and as a kid, that neighbor was always yelling at the kids on the street, hey, stop playing in the street or stop being so loud, etc. And without realizing it, your brain has filed that information away, and so maybe a new neighbor moves in down the street who's also older, and just looking at that person, your brain processes this information as, oh boy, here's another crotchety old person who's going to be yelling at me for being too loud in the street or riding my bike, etc. And maybe that person is very different from the person that you already know. Often we make these judgments about people with very, very little information. In fact, we have a word for it, lay people's terms, we call it a snap judgment, right? Where we have a very limited interaction with somebody and we come away from that interaction thinking X or Y or Z, when in fact we don't really know that much about that person. And that social environment, that limited interaction, really is just a clip of that person as an individual, and yet we may rely on it for any further interactions. And there's nothing that is unusual about this. We all do it, myself included. In fact, being aware of it means that maybe when we know we've made a snap judgment, we can take a step back and say to ourselves, okay, wait a minute. I know I made a snap judgment here. reanalyze the information I have and let me gather more information about this situation or this person before I reach a fully informed opinion about this person or this situation. Um, of course, just looking at people as well, we make those quick or snap judgments based upon how they're dressed, how their hair is styled, what kind of clothes how they're dressed, how their hair is styled, whether they're thin or tall or old or young, or whether they look nice, right? And so I'd show you really just briefly here a couple of pictures. This is a picture of a guy on a motorcycle. And just at first glance, probably a lot of people look at this guy and think, okay, well, some brown guy, heavy set, riding a motorcycle. He's probably in a motorcycle gang, got dark glasses on. He's as we say in Spanish, pelón, meaning he's bald. He's probably a bad guy. Okay? But the reality is, maybe this guy's like a big teddy bear. Maybe he's the kindest person, one of the kindest people you'll ever meet. And maybe he's not in a motorcycle gang at all. Maybe he just likes motorcycles and he happens to have lost his hair and he's riding and needs his sunglasses on because the sun is bright. And he happens to be chubby. Maybe that's all there really is to it. And yet a lot of people will make negative snap judgments about him. Then you look at this picture. Okay, so here's a woman riding a motorcycle. Okay, she's riding a motorcycle. The other person's riding a motorcycle. But people often will have different ideas about this person. Why? Because number one, gender difference. Number two, she appears to be white. Number three, she's dressed, more like a responsible motorcycle riders, right? She's got her helmet on, she's got gloves, she's got her motorcycle riding jacket on, she's thin, she appears to be pretty, at least from what you can see at this angle. She's got long hair, and so maybe people here would think, wow, strong, brave, cool biker woman, etc. They probably will think much more positive things about her simply because of the kind of motorcycle she's riding, the way that she is dressed, and just a little bit of we can see from her face, right? So again, probably the same thing that you're thinking too is, okay, well, I can catch myself. I know I probably would have thought that too. We tend to believe that when we see something, we observe it, we have what we call first-hand information, that this is the most reliable information, right? Because we saw it for ourselves. However, if you've ever gone to see David Copperfield or Chris Angel or any other illusionist, what you know is that seeing something doesn't necessarily mean that it actually happened that way, right? Because that's what an illusionist does. They make you believe that what you're seeing is not is actually happening when in fact it's not. And those who are really good at it do a great job at it, and they make lots of money doing it. Okay? So first-hand information, not always as reliable as we seem to think. And again, personal experiences, right? Just because you've had a negative experience with one individual doesn't mean that everybody else is going to have a similar negative experience with that same individual. Just think about how, you may really like an instructor and think, wow, this instructor is really great. And yet there's maybe another student in the same class who thinks, oh God, this instructor sucks. Oh God, I can't wait for this class to be over, man. This person, can't stand him or her or they. Again, same instructor, teaching the same class, same classroom, but different students come away with different personal experiences of their interactions and their experiences in that class. And then pluralistic ignorance, this happens when there's a group norm that develops or is created because people in the group see that others are accepting something that maybe they don't really agree with. People in the group are seem to be accepting of some norm or some value within the group. that maybe on a personal level, person A, say, doesn't agree with. But it seems to person A that all these other people in the group are okay with that. And so then person A may believe, well, I must be the only one that doesn't agree with this, and so I don't want to cause any waves, so I'll just go along with this, right? So we can see this in department meetings, staff meetings across workplaces, around workplaces across the U.S. Staff meetings held, supervisor says, hey, we're going to do this new thing, a new way to process information or handle clients, whatever it might be. What do people think of this new idea? Most people will sit there and go, yeah, okay, yeah, and then before you know it, everyone in the room is, oh, okay, yeah, all right. Even though there might be a few people in there thinking, well, it doesn't really make sense why we would do it that way. I think we can actually do it a better way. But they won't say anything, most of them, because they don't want to be the few who say no to the supervisor's idea when seemingly everyone else is saying, yes, what a great idea. That's pluralistic ignorance. Again, it happens with friends, it happens with family members. You can see this everywhere. A self-fulfilling prophecy. This is the tendency for people to act the way that, well, we tend as individuals to expect people to act a certain way. But what we might do unwittingly is we might actually act toward that person in such a way that we actually bring about the reaction or the interaction from the person that we were expecting. Here's an example. If you really like someone, you're going to cut them slack and you're going to overlook their flaws. But, and you're going to tell them how great and wonderful they are. And they're going to act great and wonderful. Why? Because you expect them to. If, on the other hand, you decide you don't like somebody and you treat that person in a fairly negative way, you're not very friendly, you say sarcastic things to the person, that person's probably going to respond in a negative way to you too. And you'll think, see, I knew that person was a jerk. But maybe it's because you were a jerk first and that person was responding to you being the jerk. Just something to consider in terms of when we're interacting with others. Are we always as rational and logical in our interactions with others as we believe? It turns out that often the answer is no. Again, this is for everybody. I teach this, but I have to constantly watch myself too, because it's so easy to just slip into that old behavior that we are used to, because we don't grow up as trained social psychologists. We grow up interacting with people around us the way those in our social environments teach us how to interact with others. All right. Secondhand information, of course, is whatever we get from all these other sources, right? We weren't there, but somebody else tells us what happened. Or we read it on Twitter, or we read it on Instagram, we read somebody's, we read a blog, or we maybe see it on, I don't know, Facebook, although I don't think many people are using that anymore. Whatever it might be. All this secondhand information. We take in a lot of information from these sources too. And again, some of it may be very accurate, but other secondhand information, maybe not so much. There's also the fact that some people engage in purposely transmitting or putting out information that is biased. They know that there's another side, but they say nothing about that other side to the story. And so they are purposely putting out information that will lead others to agree with them. I think there's a lot of this that happens in politics on both sides, on all sides. I think one party does it more frequently than the other party, and I'll keep that part to myself. But I think people do this often with the intent to get other people to agree with them, to get people to take their side. Again, this can happen in families as well. It's not just out in the political arena. This happens in friendship groups, or it happens in families. It may happen in the workplace. And so just be aware that people often will give information that they know will enable that person to think more like themselves, while purposely not including information that might make somebody think more logically about that issue. All right, so Primacy effect and recency effect. Primacy effect is what order do we come in? For example, if you're going to a job interview, do you want to be the first person to be interviewed or you want to be the last? Some people would say, well, it's good to be the first person because then you can, you make a really good impression and you stay on people's minds as they move through. Other people would say, well, it'd be better to be the last person to interview because then you're the last person. You're the one who's going to stick in everyone's mind because they're already tired from hearing all these other candidates. Recency effect. Recency effect is how recent is the information to someone as they are making a hiring decision. If they looked through the resumes the night before and then a new one comes in that morning and they take a look at that one right before they go into the interviews, maybe that information from that most recent interview that they read sticks with them more than the resumes of the people that they reviewed last night before they left for work. Okay, or if you are thinking about dating, maybe on a particular weekend you decide to meet 2 different people or 3 different people from some dating app to meet them for coffee. Well, you meet the first person, you meet the second person, you meet the third person. Which one of those individuals, the recency effect here, which one of those individuals are you most likely to remember the most about? Well, recency effect says it would be the person that you last have coffee with, not that first person. So again, there's nothing set in stone here. It's just our brains remember things differently depending upon the individual and depending upon the circumstances of that social interaction. Framing effects are also very important. There's this used a lot in advertising, whereby advertisers will provide information in a particular order, or they'll show us certain images that make something appear very, very tantalizing, very, very desirable, and they won't tell us some of the negative things about that product. They'll just highlight all the really positive things. They want to frame it in the most positive way possible. And of course, we can spin things to either, if we're talking about the same thing, we can either spin the framing to make something seem much more positive or much more negative, depending upon what our own position is on this thing. So, for example, inheritance tax. Now, there's always this debate over should wealthy people who pass on shitloads of money to their progeny, should that money be taxed? Okay. Now, for people who are poor, when you call it an inheritance tax, well, that sounds pretty good, right? I mean, why not tax wealthy people who have all this extra money that they actually have some left over to give to their children, their grandchildren, etc.? Inheritance tax seems pretty good. But if you call it a death tax, well, everybody dies. And so taxing people because they die, oh man, that seems like a really bad idea. We're talking about the same thing. And yet, depending upon what you call it, people will feel differently about it. The same thing with abortion, calling it someone pro-choice versus someone who is pro-abortion. Okay, now, for the record, people who support a woman's right to choose call themselves pro-choice. But the other side, people against abortion, call them, people who support a woman's right to choose, they're pro-abortion. They're in favor of abortion. They make it sound as though people who are pro-choice all believe that every woman should have an abortion at least once because, whoo boy, man, such a great experience. That is not the truth at all. And yet that's what it makes it sound like. A taxpayer bailout versus tax-assisted relief program. Okay. Now, if taxpayers are bailing out big banks or other corporations, car makers, etc., well, most people are like, what? I don't get money from the U.S., I don't get money from the government. If my business fails, why should these big banks get money, my taxpayer money, to save themselves? I'm against that. But if you call it tax assisted relief program, then you're talking about, well, we're just helping these very large corporations that employ all these hundreds of thousands of people across the nation, et cetera. That's what happened back in 2008. Initially, it was being called a taxpayer bailout. People really didn't like that, and so the Bush administration turned around and started calling it a tax assisted relief program, or TARP. And then finally, supersizing a meal. Back in the old days, before we really realized how bad it is for you to eat a large fries and a Whopper and the largest soda possible, before we realized, well, I think we always knew it, but before we really realized, and McDonald's was still offering supersizing meals. Maybe some of you are too young to remember that, but think about that. When somebody says, oh, do you want to add, whether it's, I don't know, IHOP or some other restaurant, and they say, hey, you can get a stack of pancakes for $3.99, but for another $1.50, you can get all you can eat pancakes. And you think, wow, okay, well, that sounds like a great deal. Sure. Yeah, give me the all you can eat. Okay, well, here's the thing. It depends on how you ask that. Because, for example, that supersized meal, instead of asking, hey, do you want a large ass fries and a big ass soda to go along with that double, quarter pounder burger, whatever the hell it is. If instead the question had been asked, would you like to add more salt, fat, cholesterol? Salt and sodium are the same thing, so I guess that's my typo there. More salt, fat, cholesterol, and calories to your order for just another $1? Probably some people would have stopped and like, wait, whoa. Did you say more salt, more fat, more cholesterol, and more calories for $1? Oh, I don't know if that's such a great idea. People might have thought about it a little bit more. But when you're just getting more food for a little bit extra, geez, that sounds like a great idea. The truth is, probably nobody really needs to eat all-you-can-eat pancakes because none of us are lumberjacks. We're not, burning 10,000 calories a day, 12,000 calories a day, as supposedly lumberjacks did back in the days. All right, so let me think. Confirmation bias. I wanted to point this out too. This is the tendency to test an idea by searching for evidence that supports it. And essentially, it's this. When we have an idea, an opinion, we want some confirmation that we're right. And so we tend to read certain newspapers or read certain magazines or watch certain news programs or certain documentaries or listen to certain podcasts that will prove or provide more support for this idea that our idea, our opinion, is the right one. All right, so I just want to focus on heuristics. Heuristics are intuitive mental operations. So intuitive means that, like, we're not really aware that we're thinking about this. Our brains are just processing the information. This information is being processed very quickly and automatically. So again, we're not often even aware that we're processing information and conclusions are being reached. And what happens with heuristics is that typically, as our minds process that information very quickly and rely on information that's already in our brains, we quickly reach a conclusion and make a decision. However, as I mentioned when I first started out this chapter review, that's not always the best thing for us to do. In fact, when we think about how we process information, how we do that is very unique to each one of us, right? Our brains are all unique to each one of us. They're not all the same. I mean, they may work the same, but how they process the information is different. And so it may be that our brains, some of us, our brains focus on the most accessible information first. There are other people who may want to, they like to take a little bit more time to process information. In fact, I'm guessing some of you know people who, upon hearing something new or being faced with a situation, rather than making a quick decision. You know, these are people who say, you know, let me get back to you on that. I need to think about this for a bit. Okay, it's because their brains work in such a way that they want a little bit more time. They need a little bit more time to gather more information, to add to the information that their brains already have, so that they can make a more informed decision. Now, this may make some people angry because if you're having a discussion with somebody or a disagreement, and that the other person says, "Well, you know, I need some time to really process this, to really think about it," that may not make the other person very happy because that person may want an answer here, right now. But I think we should all recognize that while we process information all the time and it's often done quickly, there are maybe social environments and social situations where we want to slow ourselves down and not just make a quick decision based upon the information that we have, whatever firsthand experience we have, firsthand observation we have. We may want to slow that down and be a little bit more deliberate in how we are processing information at times. All right, so I think, well, I'll focus on fluency really quickly here. Fluency is much like language. Fluency, because in language fluency means, you know, you don't even have to think about it. You can just speak without even thinking. If you know a second language and you're fluent in that second language, you can switch back and forth between those languages without having to tell your brain, okay, hang on, let me switch over to the other language. On the other hand, if you're like me, I speak Spanish, but not very well. So when I speak Spanish, I really have to think about, okay, conjugate the verb, and then what noun do I use, and then how do I put this whole sentence together? I really have to focus on how to say something. And so when we have fluency, that means that we are in a social environment, perhaps having social interactions in which we're comfortable with the people in that social environment, we're comfortable with what we're doing, and so our fluency, that is the ease with which we are processing information in that social environment, is very smooth. On the other hand, if you are new to a social environment, if you are new to interactions with a group of people, then you'll probably take in information a little bit more slowly and decide what to say and what to do more deliberately. Here's a perfect example of that. Let's say that you have a significant other and you are meeting the significant other's family for the first time. Well, if it's the first time or the first several times, probably going to be more careful about how you interact with these individuals. Try to pick up on how they think about certain things, even eating. You'll probably look to see, are they really focused on proper etiquette at the table, or are they more casual in regard to table etiquette? On the other hand, if you and your partner have been together for a while and you've been around their family quite a few times, then your interaction with them is probably much more fluid. You don't have to think so much about what you say and do or how you're eating, etc. And so that's the idea of fluency. All right. I think I'm going to go ahead and leave it there. And I'll see you for next week's overviews. And just remember, always read the chapter, because I only go over some of the more important ideas, but make sure you're reading the whole chapter. See ya.